Yeah, it's funny. I submitted the book proposal in 2017 that was going to be anchored in this very PMC analysis. And for those that don't know, the Professional Managerial Class was a concept coined by Barbara and John Ehrenreich in the 1970s. And then after 2017, basically the left blew up with this debate over the PMC, and it polarized the 2020 primary between the Bernie and Warren factions, and it became this extremely polarizing concept. But I had to soldier through because I really think it's important to thinking about climate politics, because if you look around about who's really driving climate advocacy, it is what you would call the professional managerial class. And I would actually include scientists as really a big part of that class. People, the way I define it in the book is people that try to marshal credentials of some kind to carve out advantages in the labor market. And that can be degrees or licenses or any types of things. But essentially, it's mostly like using hyper educated degrees to kind of create these kind of professional secure middle class types of advantages in the labor market. And so we're talking about academics, scientists, journalists, people that work at NGOs, staffers at NGOs, government bureaucrats, agents, people like this. And this is the kind of class of people that are most vocal about climate change. And essentially, like, there's a couple things that kind of define this class project in a kind of material and ideological sense. The first would be that because they're so invested in using credentials and knowledge to gain these advantages, they're really into making climate politics really about science and knowledge and believing the science and belief in denial. And really vilifying the right, not because they sanction fossil fuel extraction for profit, but more because they fund denial and they're denying the truth and they're doing a war against facts or whatever. And this really came to a fever pitch in the Trump years, right? Because it was just this sort of like from an administration that was denying truth, denying science. And if you recall, we had a March for Science. And if you kind of just go on Google Images and look at like the types of folks that went out to the March for Science, and that can be seen as like a mass action of the professional class. And the other thing about this class is, and there's a debate on whether or not we should call them a class. You could call them a stratum or a class, whatever. But is that the class project is about attaining some level of material economic security, like a sort of a middle class job in academia and journalism or whatever it might be. And so that and again, we should be clear that that's becoming more and more out of reach for much of what could be called the PMC. Like, people that follow sort of DSA politics will probably be familiar with this idea that DSA is kind of this place where downwardly mobile, college-educated people are fleeing to, and people that are working low-wage, working-class jobs but have these credentials because there's just not jobs anymore for these types of credentialed people. But the goal, obviously, is to try to use these credentials to gain this kind of middle-class security. But with that, with middle-class security comes this level of consumption that is comfortable and might involve like owning a car and even owning a home, maybe. And so and maybe like having to fly a lot for professional sort of professional reasons. And so with this middle class security, a lot of the PMC discourse becomes really focused on their own consumption as the driver, because they're participating at such a high level in these systems of consumption. They feel like instead of blaming the owners of production that I said before are really to blame, they blame themselves and say it's really, I'm engaging in this high consumption lifestyle while the world burns. And so there's this level of what I call carbon guilt and feelings of complicity. And so those are kind of the two forms of climate politics that I see really predominant amongst this PMC group.
It's not a coincidence that the same group of people are all about like lean-in style feminism, white fragility style racial reckoning and also individualistic climate action. Like those things can all fit in some sort of thesis that I haven't been able to flush out yet, or you could just call them PMC and be done with it, really.
Well, I don't know if you've ever had Catherine Liu on, but she wrote a book on the PMC called Virtue Hoarders. And to me, that title, it just really does get at a lot of what's going on here. Basically, virtue and projecting it as this sort of stuff that's really not of the masses, right? Because part of the PMC thing is kind of sneering at the masses. You know, the people that go to the mall or something are what's really destroying climate change. And so hogging this kind of virtue by putting solar panels on your roof or eating organic or going vegan, like this becomes the key kind of politics. And you can translate it to all various other forms, as you just said.
So let's talk about the strategies that the three strategies that you lay out that this group of folks, scientists, yes, PMC types, whatever, lawyers, journalists, etc., seem to emphasize. And we've talked about it, I guess, a good amount. But if you don't mind giving those 3 points and laying that out for us.
So I kind of lay out 3 archetypes of the PMC climate activists. The first is what I call the Science Communicator, and I've talked a lot about that, which is essentially, but it does subscribe to this very kind of liberal theory of change that if the masses really understood and knew the truth about climate change, then action would inevitably follow in a democracy, which I think more and more we're seeing that we don't really live in a democracy. But this idea that the real problem with the climate crisis is denial of the science, and we just need to kind of make people aware. And so obviously there's a lot of prominent climate scientists who have become really, powerful spokespeople. But I think there's also a whole kind of cadre of journalists and other, I don't know, I guess you call them influencers now, who are really sort of invested in what the science has to say and like trying to fight denial of it, right? So the Science Communicators. The next one is what I call the policy technocrats. And these are the folks that really propose a whole set of like policy technocratic fixes to the climate crisis. And these really emerged in the 1980s and 90s. It's sort of during the heyday of the kind of neoliberal revolution towards free market policies. And these policy technocrats sort of ceded the ground and said, okay, the right Reagan revolution has won. We need to design kind of really clever, smart policies that are grounded in free market ideas that can win over not only Democrats, but they even have the idea that they can win over Republicans with these really smart technocratic policies. Now, these are things like carbon taxes or cap and trade type market where you can like trade emission credits that give people certain rights or property rights to pollute, and then create a market in these emission rights. And ultimately, it boils down to this idea that the market is not adequately pricing the emissions of climate change, so that if we can just get the prices right and internalize the cost of these emissions through carbon pricing, then the market will just solve it naturally. And so the policy technocrats have been banging this drum for decades about how smart this policy is of carbon pricing. Let's put a price on carbon. But as we've hinted at before, like it might be smart to them, but when you actually try to implement this, it ultimately leads to raising the price of energy. And you see how, we're just seeing that now with inflation, but in France, when Macron tried to implement a fuel tax under the banner of climate action, it led to this kind of working class revolt amongst the yellow vest. They've tried to pass a carbon tax in the very like green liberal state of Washington in 2016 and 2018. It failed miserably. So these very smart solutions amongst the technocrats are not popular. They're not even trying to like have mass appeal.